You know what's funny about rich in-laws saying I'm just after money? The joke's on them. I'm a secret heiress, and they're about to find out exactly what that means. But let me back up, because this story gets so much better when you understand just how spectacularly wrong they were about me. The realization hit me like a slap across the face during what was supposed to be a lovely family dinner. There I was, sitting at their mahogany dining table that probably cost more than most people's cars, trying to make polite conversation about the weather while Margaret, my mother-in-law, kept shooting these little glances at her husband Harold. You know those looks. The kind that say, we need to talk about something unpleasant, but we're going to be civilized about it. My husband David was completely oblivious, cutting into his ribeye like nothing was wrong. God, how I envied that blissful ignorance in that moment. The bomb dropped during dessert. Margaret set down her wine glass with that delicate precision that screamed, "I'm about to ruin your evening," and cleared her throat. The words that came out of her mouth felt like they were wrapped in velvet, but they cut like broken glass. She was concerned, she said, about my intentions with David. After all, I'd come from such humble beginnings, her exact words, and David was set to inherit quite a substantial fortune someday. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, a piece of tiramisu balanced precariously on the end. The cream suddenly tasted like ash. She continued, her voice dripping with false concern, explaining how they'd noticed I'd been asking questions about family finances, how I seemed particularly interested in David's trust fund, how my own family's circumstances. Well, surely I could understand their worry. Harold nodded along like a bobblehead, occasionally murmuring agreement. "We just want what's best for David," he added, as if I wasn't sitting right there. The heat started in my chest, spreading outward like wildfire. My hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from pure, concentrated rage. These people, these absolute fucking people, thought I was some kind of gold digger. They thought I'd married their precious son for his money. If only they knew. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Here I was, worth more than their entire family combined, being lectured about my financial motivations. The trust fund they were so worried about protecting? It was pocket change compared to what I had sitting in accounts they couldn't even imagine. But I didn't say any of that. I just sat there, watching their mouths move, feeling my world shift on its axis. David was staring at his plate now, his ears red with embarrassment. He mumbled something about how maybe we should talk about this later, but his parents steamrolled right over him. Margaret leaned forward, her perfectly manicured hands folded in front of her. She suggested, so kindly, so generously, that perhaps I might consider signing a post-nuptial agreement. Just to put everyone's minds at ease, you understand. The blood rushing in my ears was so loud I was surprised they couldn't hear it. My vision sharpened to a pinpoint focus, like a predator zeroing in on prey. Every detail of that dining room burned itself into my memory. The way the chandelier cast shadows across Margaret's face, the smell of her expensive perfume mixing with the lingering aroma of dinner, the sound of Harold's heavy breathing as he waited for my response. I managed to keep my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I told them I'd think about it. I thanked them for their concern. I even managed to finish my dessert, though it tasted like cardboard. The drive home was excruciating. David kept apologizing, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He said he'd talk to them, that they were just being protective, that they'd come around once they got to know me better. Sweet, naive David. He had no idea what his parents had just unleashed. I stared out the passenger window, watching the city lights blur past, and felt something cold and calculated settling in my chest. They wanted to play games about money? They wanted to question my motives, my worth, my place in their precious family? Fine, let's play. The thing about growing up poor, and I mean really poor, not the kind of poor where you can't afford the latest iPhone, is that you learn to be invisible. You learn to listen. You learn to observe. And most importantly, you learn to wait for the right moment to strike. My grandmother used to say that revenge is a dish best served cold. She was right about a lot of things, but she was especially right about that. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David snored softly beside me. My mind was racing, cataloging every slight, every condescending smile, every perfectly polite insult I'd endured over the past 2 years. They thought they knew me. They thought they had me figured out. They had no fucking clue. See, here's what Margaret and Harold didn't know about their son's wife. I am the sole heir to the Blackwood fortune. Yeah, that Blackwood fortune. The one that's been quietly growing for 4 generations while staying completely out of the public eye. The one that makes their little real estate empire look like a lemonade stand. My great-grandfather started with nothing and built an empire. My grandfather expanded it. My father refined it. And when they all died, car accident when I was 16, every last penny came to me. But here's the kicker. The money was held in trust until I turned 25, with the stipulation that I had to graduate college and prove I could manage my own life responsibly. The lawyers who managed the trust were under strict instructions to keep everything quiet. No publicity, no flashy spending, no drawing attention to the family name. Just quiet, steady wealth accumulation while I lived like a normal person. I graduated at 22. I got a job at a nonprofit, because what else do you do when you're killing time until you inherit more money than God? I met David at a charity gala where I was serving drinks and he was writing checks. He thought I was just another struggling do-gooder trying to make the world better, and I let him think that, because for the first time in my life, someone liked me for who I was, not what I had. Or in this case, what they thought I didn't have. The trust matured 6 months ago. I am now worth approximately $847 million, give or take a few million depending on how the markets are doing. I own properties on 4 continents, have stakes in companies these people shop at, and could buy their entire social circle without checking my bank balance. But I'd kept living like the same broke nonprofit worker because I was happy. David was happy. We were planning our future together and money was just there. In the background, waiting. I never asked David about his trust fund because I didn't give a shit about his trust fund. I asked about family finances because I was trying to figure out how to tell him about mine without completely destroying his sense of reality. And now? Now his parents had gone and made this about money. Big fucking mistake. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Richard Pembroke, senior partner at Pembroke, Hayes & Associates. The man who'd been managing my affairs since I was 16, and who had very specific instructions about what to do if anyone ever questioned my motives for marrying David. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I've been waiting for this call. It's time, Richard. I'll have the papers ready by end of business today. Should we proceed with the full disclosure package?" "Oh yes, the full package. I want them to understand exactly who they're dealing with." The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. Margaret and Harold wanted a post-nuptial agreement. They were going to get one, along with a few other documents that would make their fucking heads spin. I spent the day at work, going through the motions of my normal routine while my mind raced with possibilities. My co-workers at the nonprofit had no idea that their mild-mannered colleague was about to drop the most spectacular bombshell in the history of family drama. The beautiful thing about secrets is that they give you power. And I was about to use every ounce of that power to teach these people a lesson they'd never forget. By evening, everything was in place. Richard had outdone himself. The documents were pristine, the revelations perfectly timed, the trap set with mathematical precision. Margaret and Harold thought they were dealing with some gold-digging nobody who'd gotten lucky with their son. They were about to learn that they'd been condescending to someone who could buy and sell them like a commodity. And David? Sweet, innocent David was about to discover that his wife had been keeping a secret that would change everything. The stage was set. The players were in position. All that remained was to watch them realize just how spectacularly they'd fucked up. Because when you come for someone, you better make sure you know who you're dealing with. And Margaret and Harold? They clearly had no idea. The next 3 days were a masterclass in self-control. I had to act normal while my entire world had shifted into revenge mode. Do you know how hard it is to make small talk about weekend plans when you're secretly orchestrating the most epic takedown in family history? Every conversation felt like I was acting in a play where only I knew the real script. David kept bringing up his parents' suggestion about the post-nuptial agreement. Poor guy was so uncomfortable about the whole thing, stumbling over his words like he was walking through a minefield. He'd start sentences and then stop, run his hands through his hair, and stare at me with these puppy dog eyes that just screamed, "Please don't be mad at my horrible parents." "Maybe we should just sign something simple," he said over breakfast Tuesday morning. "You know, just to keep the peace?" I almost choked on my coffee. Keep the peace. If he only knew what kind of peace I was about to bring to his family. "Sure, honey," I said, stirring sugar into my mug with deliberate calm. "Whatever you think is best." He looked so relieved. God, I felt like such a fraud. But also, I felt like a fucking chess master moving pieces around a board that no one else could see. The hardest part was pretending to be hurt by their accusations when really I was just angry. Not hurt angry, cold angry. The kind of anger that calculates and plans and waits for the perfect moment to strike. Margaret and Harold had no idea they'd awakened something in me that had been sleeping for years. See, here's the thing about growing up with money and then losing it all, then getting it back. You learn that people's true nature comes out when they think they have power over you. Margaret and Harold thought they held all the cards. They thought they were the ones with the money, the influence, the ability to make or break my marriage to their son. They were about to learn that assumption was their first mistake. Richard called me Wednesday afternoon with updates. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The documents were being prepared, the financial disclosures were being compiled, and the lawyers were practically salivating at the thought of what was about to happen. "Mrs. Blackwood," Richard said, his voice carrying that particular tone lawyers get when they're about to deliver spectacular news, "I've reviewed the Ashford family finances as requested." The Ashfords. That was David's family name. Even thinking it made my blood pressure spike. And, well, they're certainly comfortable. The father's real estate holdings are worth approximately $12 million, give or take. The mother's boutique business brings in maybe $300,000 annually. David's trust fund is set at $4 million, accessible when he turns 30 next year. I did quick math in my head. Their entire family's net worth was roughly $16 million. I made more than that in investment returns every month. So when you present them with your disclosure documents, it's going to be like showing a house cat a lion, Richard finished. The comparison will be striking. Striking. I loved that word. It implied force, impact, the kind of blow that changes everything. That night, I stood in our bathroom brushing my teeth and really looked at myself in the mirror. 26 years old, average height, brown hair that I usually kept in a simple ponytail, brown eyes that most people described as warm. I looked like exactly what I was, a nonprofit worker who shopped at Target and drove a 5-year-old Honda Civic. I definitely didn't look like someone worth nearly $1 billion, and that was exactly the point. My great-grandfather used to say that the best weapon is the one your enemy doesn't see coming. He'd built his fortune by letting people underestimate him, by appearing smaller and less threatening than he actually was. Then, when they least expected it, he'd strike with devastating precision. The apple, as they say, doesn't fall far from the tree. Thursday morning, Margaret called. I was at work, trying to focus on a grant application, when my phone rang. Her name on the caller ID made my stomach clench with anticipation. "Hello, Margaret," I said, making my voice sound slightly strained, like I was still processing their dinner conversation. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, and I could practically hear her false sympathy dripping through the phone. "I just wanted to check in. I know our conversation the other night was difficult. Difficult. That was one word for it. I'm fine," I said, injecting just enough vulnerability into my tone to make her feel like she had the upper hand. "I've been thinking about what you said." "Oh, good. I'm so glad. You know, dear, we really do care about you. We just want what's best for everyone." The patronizing tone in her voice made me want to throw my phone against the wall. Instead, I gripped it tighter and smiled. She couldn't see the smile, but I felt it transform my face into something sharp and predatory. "I understand," I said. "Actually, I was hoping we could all sit down again soon. I have some things I'd like to discuss." "Of course. How about dinner Friday night? Same time?" "Friday night. Perfect." That gave Richard exactly enough time to put the finishing touches on our little presentation. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "I'll bring some documents with me, so we can handle everything properly." "Documents?" She sounded pleased. Probably thought I was coming with a pre-written surrender treaty. "Just some paperwork my lawyer suggested. Nothing too complicated." "Your lawyer?" Her voice sharpened slightly. "You have a lawyer?" "Oh, just someone I consulted about the post-nuptial agreement. I wanted to make sure I understood everything correctly." There was a pause. I could practically hear her brain working, trying to figure out how a broke non-profit worker could afford legal consultation. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose that's responsible of you." "I try to be responsible with important matters," I said, allowing just a hint of steel to creep into my voice. After we hung up, I sat back in my chair and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of the hunt. This must be what predators feel like when they're circling their prey. Margaret and Harold thought they were dealing with a cornered animal. They had no idea they were about to come face to face with an apex predator. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went shopping. Not at Target or TJ Maxx, where I usually bought my clothes. I went to the kind of stores I used to frequent before I decided to play poor. The kind of stores where they remember your name and your preferences, where they bring you champagne while you try on clothes that cost more than most people's rent. I needed an outfit for Friday night, something that would send a very specific message. The sales associate at Bergdorf's recognized me immediately, even though I hadn't been there in 2 years. Money has a way of making people remember you. "Ms. Blackwood," she said, her face lighting up. "It's been so long. How lovely to see you again." I'd forgotten how good it felt to be recognized for who I really was. To have someone treat me like I mattered, like I was worth their time and attention. "Hello, Carmen," I said, slipping back into the persona I'd abandoned when I met David. "I need something for a very special dinner." "Of course. What's the occasion?" "Let's just say it's time to reveal some truths." Carmen's eyes sparkled with interest. She'd dressed enough wealthy women to recognize the tone of someone about to make a statement. 20 minutes later, I was looking at myself in a mirror, wearing an outfit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Black silk blouse, perfectly tailored charcoal gray pants, and a blazer that probably cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe. I looked like what I was, serious money. The kind of money that doesn't need to announce itself because it's so confident in its own power. "Perfect," I said, and Carmen smiled like she'd just helped orchestrate something magnificent. Because she had. That night, I sat David down for what I told him was an important conversation. He looked nervous, probably expecting me to say I was upset about his parents or wanted to call off the whole post-nuptial agreement thing. "I need to tell you something," I said, taking his hands in mine. "Something important." His face went pale. "Are you leaving me?" "No, baby. Never. But I haven't been entirely honest with you about something." I could see his mind racing, trying to figure out what secret I could possibly have. An ex-boyfriend? A criminal past? Debt problems? "I'm not who you think I am," I said carefully. "I mean, I am, but I'm also more." "I don't understand." "You will. Tomorrow night, when we go to your parents' house, everything is going to change. I'm going to tell them some things. Things that will probably shock them. And you." David's grip on my hands tightened. "What kind of things?" "The kind of things that will make their concerns about me being a gold digger seem ironic." He stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for clues. "You're scaring me." "Don't be scared. Nothing bad is going to happen." "Well, nothing bad is going to happen to us. Your parents, they might need some time to process." "Process what?" I smiled, the same predatory smile I'd worn during my phone call with Margaret. "You'll see." That night I barely slept. Not because I was nervous, I was way past nervous. I was in that zone athletes talk about, where everything slows down and becomes crystal clear. Every detail of the plan was perfect. Every contingency was accounted for. Every possible reaction had been anticipated and prepared for. Margaret and Harold thought they were bringing me to heel. They thought they were going to put me in my place, make me sign their little agreement, and establish the proper power dynamic in the family. They were about to learn that they'd been playing checkers while I was playing chess, and I was about to achieve checkmate. Friday morning, Richard called with the final details. The documents were ready. The financial disclosures were complete. The presentation was designed to deliver maximum impact with surgical precision. "Are you ready for this, Mrs. Blackwood?" he asked. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, already dressed in my statement outfit, my hair perfectly styled, my makeup flawless. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman with nearly $1 billion who was about to remind some people about the importance of respect. "I've been ready for this my whole life," I said, because I had been. Every slight, every condescending comment, every moment of being treated like I was less than, it had all been leading to this. Margaret and Harold had no idea they were about to meet the real me, and the real me was about to show them what a mistake looked like when it was worth $847 million. The stage was set. The trap was ready. All that remained was to watch it spring. Friday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes everything feel sharper, more alive. I spent an extra 20 minutes getting ready, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted every detail to be perfect. This was my debut performance as the real me, and I intended to make it memorable. David kept glancing at me during the drive to his parents' house, his forehead creased with worry. I could practically hear the questions bouncing around in his head, but he didn't ask them. Maybe he was afraid of the answers. Smart man. "You look different tonight?" he said finally, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "Different how?" I adjusted my blazer, feeling the weight of Richard's documents in my leather portfolio. "I don't know. More intense? Like you're going to war or something." I smiled, watching the familiar neighborhood roll past. The kind of neighborhood where every house cost more than most people would make in a lifetime, where perfectly manicured lawns competed with each other for suburban supremacy. Not going to war, baby. Just leveling the playing field. We pulled into the circular driveway, and I saw Margaret peeking through the curtains. She probably wanted to get a good look at my outfit, maybe gauge my mood before we sat down. I wondered what she made of the clothes, the confident way I walked to the door. Did she notice that my purse cost more than most people's monthly rent? Did she wonder where a non-profit worker got such expensive taste? Harold opened the door before we could knock, his face arranged in that particular expression men wear when they're about to have an uncomfortable conversation, but want to appear reasonable. "David!" and "Sarah," he said, my name coming out like he was tasting something unpleasant. "Please come in." The house smelled like roast beef and Margaret's signature perfume, that cloying floral scent that probably cost $300 an ounce. The dining room was set for 4, with their good china and crystal glasses that caught the light from the chandelier. Everything designed to remind me that this was their domain, their territory, their rules. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, her smile as fake as a $3 bill. She was wearing what I recognized as her serious conversation outfit, a conservative navy dress that said, "I'm about to handle some business." "Sarah, dear," she said, air-kissing my cheek. "You look lovely." I could hear the question mark in her voice. She'd noticed the upgrade in my appearance but couldn't quite place what it meant. Poor Margaret. She was about to find out. "Thank you," I said, settling into my chair, the same chair where I'd been ambushed 3 days ago. "I brought those documents we discussed." I placed the leather portfolio on the table next to my plate, close enough that everyone could see it but far enough that no one could casually flip it open. The weight of it seemed to draw everyone's attention like a gravitational pull. "Oh, good," Margaret said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "I have to admit I'm curious about what your lawyer suggested. I think you'll find it very illuminating." We went through the motions of dinner conversation while the tension built like pressure in a steam engine. Margaret asked about my work at the nonprofit. Harold mentioned something about the weather. David pushed food around his plate like he was building small architectural structures out of his mashed potatoes. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, knowing this was the last meal I'd ever have to pretend to be something I wasn't. The last time I'd have to smile politely while these people condescended to me. The last time I'd have to bite my tongue while they questioned my motives and my worth. "So," Harold said finally, setting down his fork with the deliberate precision of a man about to handle unpleasant business, "should we discuss this post-nuptial agreement?" "Absolutely," I said, reaching for my portfolio. "I think that's a wonderful idea." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with anticipation. She probably thought I was about to capitulate, to sign whatever document they'd prepared that would officially establish me as the gold-digging interloper who'd been properly put in her place. "Now," I said, opening the portfolio and pulling out the first document, "my lawyer explained that in any post-nuptial agreement, both parties need to provide full financial disclosure. You know, so everyone knows exactly what they're working with." Harold nodded approvingly. "Very sensible. Very professional. I'm glad you think so," I said, placing the document in front of him. "This is David's financial disclosure, prepared by your family's accountant." He glanced at it, probably seeing familiar numbers. David's salary, his savings account, his impending trust fund. All very neat and tidy and exactly what they expected. "And this?" I said, pulling out a much thicker document, "is mine." The moment that document hit the table, the entire energy of the room shifted. It was like watching a movie where the soundtrack suddenly goes silent and everyone starts moving in slow motion. Margaret's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Harold's eyes widened as he took in the sheer thickness of the papers. David stopped pretending to eat and stared at the document like it was a bomb that might explode. "I have to warn you," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "It's a bit longer than David's." Harold reached for it with the careful movements of someone handling something that might be dangerous. His eyes skimmed the first page, and I watched his face go through a series of expressions that would have been hilarious if I hadn't been so focused on memorizing every detail. Confusion, then concentration. then a kind of dawning realization that made his face go pale. This can't be right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What can't be right?" Margaret asked, leaning over to look at the document. The moment she saw the numbers, her reaction was even better than Harold's. Her mouth actually fell open, like cartoon-level jaw-dropping shock. The wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor, sending red liquid spreading across the white carpet like blood. $847 million. Harold read aloud, his voice hollow. Net worth, $847 million. David's fork clattered to his plate. What? Keep reading, I said, settling back in my chair like I was watching the most entertaining show of my life. It gets better. Harold's hands were shaking as he turned the pages. Blackwood Holdings, Blackwood Real Estate, Blackwood International ... He looked up at me, his face the color of old newspaper. Blackwood. Your name is Blackwood. Sarah Blackwood, I confirmed. Sole heir to the Blackwood fortune. You know, the one that's been quietly growing for the past 4 generations while staying completely out of the public eye. Margaret made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. But you work at a nonprofit. You drive a Honda Civic. You shop at Target. I do all of those things. I agreed. Because I wanted to. Because I enjoyed living simply. Because I thought it was nice to have a normal life for a while. A while? David's voice cracked like a teenager's. The trust matured 6 months ago, I explained, pulling out another document. This is the letter from my lawyers, dated 6 months and 3 days ago, officially notifying me that I had gained full access to the family fortune. I let that sink in for a moment. 6 months ago, long after David and I had started dating, long after I'd met his parents, long after any reasonable person could claim I was interested in their son for his money. So when you asked about David's trust fund, Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. I was trying to figure out how to tell my husband that I was worth more than his entire family combined without completely destroying his sense of reality. I smiled, feeling the satisfaction spread through my chest like warm honey. I was trying to be considerate. Harold was still staring at the financial disclosure like it was written in a foreign language. This says you own properties in Manhattan, and London, and Tokyo, among other places. The penthouse in Manhattan has a lovely view of Central Park. The London property is right in Mayfair. Very convenient for business meetings. I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. The Tokyo property is more of an investment. Real estate there is quite lucrative. You have stakes in... Harold was reading down the list, his voice getting weaker with each item. Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft. My great-grandfather always said diversification was key. He was very smart about investments. Margaret was staring at me like I'd just revealed I was an alien. But you seemed so normal. I am normal. I'm just normal with a lot of money. I pulled out the final document, the one Richard had prepared with special care, which brings us to this. The document was titled Proposed Postnuptial Agreement, Ashford-Blackwood Marriage. I placed it in the center of the table like I was laying down a royal flush. Since you were so concerned about protecting David's assets, I said, I thought we should make sure everything is properly documented. Harold opened the document with trembling hands. I watched his eyes move across the first page, then the second, then the third. With each page, his face got paler. This protects David's trust fund, he said slowly, among other things, and it establishes separate property for all assets acquired before the marriage. Exactly. Which means, he looked up at me, understanding dawning in his eyes, which means David has no claim to any of your fortune. Not a penny, I confirmed cheerfully, unless something happens to me, in which case he inherits everything. But while I'm alive, what's mine is mine. Margaret looked like she was about to faint. You're protecting your fortune from David? I'm protecting my fortune from anyone who might question my motives for marrying your son. I let that hang in the air for a moment. After all, we wouldn't want anyone to think I was just after money. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. David was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Margaret was gripping the edge of the table like she was drowning. Harold was still reading through the document, his lips moving silently as he processed each devastating clause. There's more, I said because I wasn't quite finished. I pulled out a smaller document, this one bearing the letterhead of Pembroke, Hayes, and Associates. This is a letter from my legal team to your family's lawyer. Harold took it with the careful movements of someone who expected it to explode. His eyes scanned the single page, and I watched his face go through one final transformation, from shock to something that looked almost like terror. They're requesting a meeting to discuss the defamation implications of questioning my financial motives. Defamation? Margaret's voice was barely a squeak. Well, when you publicly question someone's character by suggesting they're a gold digger, especially when that person is worth nearly $1 billion, it can be considered defamatory. I shrugged like this was just a minor technicality. My lawyers thought it was important to address. "We didn't mean," Harold started. "You didn't mean to call me a gold digger in front of your son? You didn't mean to suggest I was only interested in David's money? You didn't mean to ask me to sign a document that would essentially brand me as a fortune hunter?" I tilted my head, studying his face. "What exactly did you mean?" David finally found his voice. "Sarah, why didn't you tell me?" I turned to face my husband, seeing the confusion and hurt in his eyes. "Because I loved that you fell in love with me when you thought I was just some broke nonprofit worker. I loved that you wanted to marry me even though you thought I couldn't contribute financially to our future. I loved that you chose me when you thought I was nothing special." "But you're not nothing special," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm exactly who I've always been. I just happen to have a lot of money." I reached across the table and took his hand. "The only thing that's changed is that your parents now know they've been condescending to someone who could buy and sell them like a commodity." Margaret made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a laugh. We had no idea." "No, you didn't. And that's the problem." I stood up, smoothing my blazer, feeling the power of the moment flowing through me like electricity. "You didn't bother to actually get to know me. You just looked at my background, made assumptions about my motives, and decided I wasn't good enough for your son. We were just trying to protect David," Harold said weakly. "From what? From a woman who loves him unconditionally? From someone who chose him when she thought he was the one with all the money?" I laughed, and it came out sharper than I intended. "You were trying to protect David from the best thing that ever happened to him." I walked around the table, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor, and stood behind David's chair. I placed my hands on his shoulders, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Your son married someone who could give him anything he's ever wanted. Someone who could buy him any house, any car, any experience his heart desires. Someone who could set him up for life in ways you can't even imagine." I squeezed his shoulders gently. "And he earned that by being the kind of man worthy of that kind of love." Margaret was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streaks. "We're so sorry. We didn't know." "No, you didn't know. And you didn't care to find out. You just decided I was a threat and acted accordingly." I moved back to my chair, but I didn't sit down. "The irony is, if you'd just been kind to me, if you'd just treated me like a person instead of a problem to be solved, none of this would have been necessary." Harold was still staring at the financial documents like they might disappear if he looked away. What do you want from us?" "I want you to sign the post-nuptial agreement," I said simply. "I want you to officially acknowledge that I'm not after your son's money. I want you to put it in writing that David's trust fund is completely safe from his gold-digging wife." "But you don't need our money," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "No, I don't. But you need to sign that document. You need to admit that you were wrong about me. You need to acknowledge that the woman you tried to humiliate is actually in a position to help your family in ways you never imagined." "Help us how?" Harold asked cautiously. I smiled, and this time it wasn't predatory. It was the smile of someone who'd just realized they held all the cards and was feeling generous. Well, for starters, I could invest in Harold's real estate business. Turn it from a $12 million operation into something that actually matters. I could help Margaret expand her boutique into a real fashion empire. I could set up trust funds for any grandchildren that make David's inheritance look like lunch money. The room was so quiet I could hear Margaret's ragged breathing. "But first," I continued, "I need to know that you understand who you're dealing with. I need to know that you respect me. And I need to know that you're never, ever going to question my motives again." David stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. He turned to face me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my heart race. Not fear, not anger, but something that looked almost like awe. "You're incredible," he said quietly. "You're absolutely incredible. I'm just a woman who got tired of being underestimated." He laughed, and it was the first genuine sound anyone had made all evening. "Underestimated? Sarah, you just destroyed my parents' entire worldview in the space of 20 minutes. They destroyed their own worldview," I corrected. I just provided the evidence. Harold cleared his throat, his voice still shaky. The postnuptial agreement. What exactly does it say? It says that David's trust fund is completely protected from any claims I might make. It says that all property acquired before our marriage remains separate property. It says that I waive any claim to his family's assets, now or in the future. I paused, watching his face. And it says that his family acknowledges that I entered this marriage with significantly greater financial resources than their son. Margaret looked up from her tear-stained napkin. Significantly greater? About 200 times greater, give or take. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. 200 times greater. Margaret's boutique brought in maybe $300,000 a year. I made more than that in investment returns every single day. We'll sign it, Harold said quietly. We'll sign whatever you want. Good. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a pen, a Mont Blanc that cost more than most people's monthly car payment. There's one more thing. Margaret looked up hopefully, probably thinking I was about to offer some kind of olive branch. I want an apology, I said simply. A real one. Not because you got caught being wrong, but because you hurt someone you're supposed to love. David's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt like coming home. I want you to apologize for making your son feel like he had to choose between his wife and his family. I want you to apologize for making me feel like I wasn't good enough. And I want you to apologize for assuming the worst about someone you barely knew. Margaret's shoulders shook as she cried. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We were wrong about everything. You were wrong about everything. I agreed. But you're going to sign that document, and then we're going to move forward. Because despite everything, I love your son. And if you can learn to treat me with the respect I deserve, maybe we can build something better than what we had. Harold reached for the pen with trembling hands. We'll do better. We promise. I hope so, I said, watching him sign the document that would officially acknowledge his massive fuck-up. Because the woman you thought was a gold digger just became the most powerful person in your family. And now, I continued as Margaret signed her name with shaking hands, we're going to finish dinner. We're going to have a civilized conversation about how we move forward from here. And we're never, ever going to talk about money again. I sat back down, smoothed my napkin across my lap, and smiled at my husband. Unless, of course, you want to discuss that vacation house in the Hamptons I've been thinking about buying. David started laughing, deep, genuine laughter that shook his entire body. The Hamptons? Oceanfront. 24 bedrooms. Perfect for family gatherings. Margaret looked up from her tear-stained napkin, her eyes wide. 24 bedrooms? Well, I said, cutting into my now cold roast beef, we're going to need somewhere to put all those grandchildren I'm planning to spoil rotten. And for the first time since I'd walked into this house, Margaret smiled at me like she meant it. The game was over. I'd won. But more importantly, I'd won in a way that left room for everyone to save face and move forward. Because that's what real power looks like. Not just the ability to destroy your enemies, but the wisdom to know when to stop. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my actual office, not the cramped little space at the nonprofit, but the corner office on the 42nd floor of the Blackwood building in Manhattan, and I'm thinking about that dinner, about the look on Margaret's face when she realized she'd been lecturing someone who could buy her entire world without checking their bank balance. About Harold's hands shaking as he signed that post-nuptial agreement. About David's laughter when he finally understood that his wife wasn't just some broke do-gooder he'd rescued from obscurity. The revenge was perfect. Absolutely devastatingly perfect. But you know what's funny about perfect revenge? Once you've had it, once you've watched your enemies realize exactly how badly they fucked up, there's this moment of emptiness. Like you've been building toward this crescendo your entire life, and then it's over, and you're left wondering what comes next. Don't get me wrong, I'm not sorry I did it. Margaret and Harold deserved every second of that humiliation. They deserved to understand what it felt like to be completely, utterly wrong about someone. They deserved to know that their condescending little speeches about my humble beginnings were delivered to someone who could have bought their entire social circle as a hobby investment. But the real satisfaction wasn't in watching them squirm. It was in watching David's face when he realized that his wife, the woman he'd fallen in love with when he thought she was just another struggling nonprofit worker, was actually someone who could give him a life beyond his wildest dreams, and that she'd chosen him anyway. The changes started immediately. Within a week, Harold had called Richard's office to discuss potential investment opportunities. Margaret sent flowers to my apartment, my actual apartment, not the modest little place I'd been renting to maintain my cover. She'd somehow found out about the penthouse through whatever network rich women use to gather intelligence on each other. David moved in with me officially the following month. Watching him walk through rooms that cost more than most people's houses, seeing him try to process that this was his life now, was better than any revenge I could have orchestrated. He kept touching things like he was afraid they'd disappear. The marble countertops, the original Picasso in the living room, the view of Central Park that stretched out like a painting. "I still can't believe this is real," he said one morning, standing on the balcony in his pajamas, looking out over the city like he owned it, which technically he sort of did now. "It's real," I told him, wrapping my arms around him from behind. "And it's ours. Ours." He repeated the word like he was tasting it. "I'm married to someone who owns half of Manhattan." "Not half, maybe a third." He laughed, and I felt the tension leave his shoulders. It had taken him months to fully accept that this wasn't some elaborate joke, that his wife really was worth more money than he could conceptualize. But gradually, he'd started to relax into it. Started to understand that the woman he'd fallen in love with was exactly the same person. I just happened to have resources that made his trust fund look like pocket change. The family dynamics shifted too, in ways I hadn't entirely anticipated. Margaret started inviting me to things, charity galas, society luncheons, the kind of events where wealthy women gather to spend money on good causes and judge each other's accessories. At first, I thought it was just ass-kissing, her way of trying to get back into my good graces. But gradually, I realized it was something else. She was trying to understand me, to figure out how someone with my background could have hidden in plain sight for so long. "You're different from other wealthy people," she told me over lunch at some exclusive restaurant where the waiters probably made more than most people's annual salaries. "You don't flaunt it." "My great-grandfather taught me that the best power is invisible power," I said, cutting into my ridiculously expensive salad. "People can't use your wealth against you if they don't know you have it." "Is that why you hid it from David?" I considered the question, twirling my fork in the greens. "I hid it from David because I wanted to know he loved me for who I was, not what I had. I wanted to be sure that when he chose me, he was choosing me." Margaret nodded slowly. "And now? Now I know. He fell in love with a non-profit worker who drove a Honda Civic. Everything else is just bonus." Harold was different too. The bluster was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. He started coming to me for business advice, asking my opinion on real estate deals and investment opportunities. The funny thing was, I actually enjoyed helping him. Turns out, when you remove the condescension and the assumption that you're some kind of gold-digging threat, Harold was actually pretty smart about business. "I could help you expand," I told him one afternoon, reviewing his latest project proposal. "Turn this from a local operation into something regional, maybe national." His eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "You'd do that?" "I'd invest in that. There's a difference." I smiled, remembering the lessons my great-grandfather had taught me about mixing business with family. "But yes, I think it could be very profitable for everyone involved." Within 6 months, Harold's little real estate company had become Ashford Blackwood Properties, with offices in 3 states and plans for national expansion. Margaret's boutique had transformed into a chain of upscale fashion stores, each one carrying the kind of clothes that women like her bought to make statements at charity galas. David had quit his corporate job to help manage the family businesses, which was hilarious because now he was technically my employee. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the night Margaret called me to ask for advice about a family problem. Not money advice, personal advice. She was worried about her sister's marriage, and she wanted to know what I thought she should do. "Why are you asking me?" I said, genuinely curious. "Because you're the smartest person I know," she said simply. "And because I was wrong about you. So wrong that I almost lost my son's respect, and I almost lost the chance to know someone who could have made our family stronger from the beginning." That was the moment I knew the revenge was complete. Not because I'd humiliated them, but because I'd earned something more valuable than their fear. I'd earned their respect. The nonprofit asked me to stay on as a board member, which was perfect because I'd actually missed the work. Helping people, making a difference, that had never been about the money. It had been about having a purpose, about using my time for something meaningful. Now I could do both, run my family's business empire and continue the work that had made me feel human during those years of hiding. David proposed again 6 months after the dinner. Not because we weren't already married, but because he wanted to do it right this time. He wanted to propose to the real me, knowing everything about who I was and what I brought to our marriage. "I fell in love with Sarah the nonprofit worker," he said, down on one knee in our living room, holding a ring that probably cost more than his parents' house. "But I want to spend my life with Sarah Blackwood, the woman who's going to change the world." I said yes, obviously, because despite everything, despite the lies, the secrets, the elaborate revenge plot, we'd found something real. Something that transcended money and family drama and the complicated dance of power and vulnerability that defines every relationship. The wedding was small, just family and close friends. Margaret cried during the ceremony, but they were happy tears this time. Harold walked me down the aisle, which was his idea, not mine. "I want to do this right," he said when he asked. "I want to show everyone that you're not just David's wife, you're our daughter." As I sit here now, looking out over the city that my great-grandfather helped build, I think about the lesson in all of this. It's not about money, not really. It's about respect, about the difference between being feared and being valued, about the power that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let anyone make you feel like less. Margaret and Harold thought they were dealing with someone beneath them, someone they could intimidate and control. They learned that assumptions can be dangerous, especially when you're dealing with someone who's been underestimated their entire life. But more than that, they learned that real power doesn't come from what you have. It comes from who you are when you think no one is watching. And I'd spent 2 years being exactly who I was, money or no money, family fortune or no family fortune. The revenge was perfect, but the real victory was building something better from the ashes of their assumptions. And now, when people ask me about my marriage, about how I knew David was the one, I tell them the truth. I knew because he loved me when he thought I was nobody special. He loved me when he thought I was just another broke dreamer trying to make the world better. That's the kind of love you can build a life on. Everything else is just numbers in a bank account, even if those numbers happen to be pretty fucking impressive.